Hi, this is Dr. Wood, and this is our Week 4 lecture. This week, we will be having an introduction to poetry, poets, and poetic language. Our poetry will primarily be found in the Seashell Anthology of Great Poetry. And so I would like you to make sure that you have this book. It's available from Amazon on Kindle, and it's not very expensive, so it's something that hopefully you all have. And when you're reading our poetry for our class, remember to read the poetry out loud at least once. I kind of like to alternate with reading it out loud and then reading the poem again silently and alternate and read it again out loud. Look up words you don't know when you're reading poetry. The meaning of each word is very important. You don't want to miss the point of the poem just because of one word you did not ever see before. And poets love unusual words. And when you read, savor the poem, the sounds, the rhythm, the word play, rhyming words at the end of the lines or inside lines, such as line and fine. Repetitive sounds like alliteration, the same sound at the beginning of a number of words in the same passage, such as fine feathered friends, which I'm sorry is a cliche. And then words that may have multiple meanings, such as wing, which could be a noun or a verb, fire, which has all kinds of meanings, toast, which could be as mundane as the toast we eat for breakfast, or we may be making a toast to someone on New Year's Eve, and then the word record, or is it record? And then the form of the poem, and some poems have an established form like a sonnet, and those forms of sonnets have been around for hundreds of years, or your poem that you're reading at the moment might be free verse, whatever form the poet thought fit the work. And then also we should look out for and enjoy symbolic or metaphorical language such as mermaids and tigers. And our culture have really put some images around those words. So mermaids, maybe you kind of know what you think a mermaid would look like. And then tigers, what do tigers mean? Are they just majestic animals, or do they have other symbolism around them? And try and feel the poem, because poetry can express deep feelings. This is a poem that expresses deep feelings, and it has a very deep tradition behind it, and it's The Creation by James Weldon Johnson. And this poem is especially powerful when read out loud, and I have given you all a video of a beautiful rendition of this poem in our weekly module this week. And this poem is based on the biblical story of the world's creation. It's full of imagery of the majestic God, so this like large majestic images, and also concrete images of the real world, the world that we actually live in and has real consequences and real things. And these directly quoted lines are an example of the rhythm and depth of the poem, and how we go from larger things like God down to the smallest things here on earth. Then God reached out and took the light in his hands, and God rolled the light around in his hands until he made the sun, and he set that sun ablazing in the heavens. And that passage just makes me want to sing it, but I will spare you that. And then continuing to look at The Creation by James Weldon Johnson, because every single line of a poem can be significant. So we don't want to blow through a poem. And so during the course of this poem, we read about how God spat out the seven seas, and then, and this is all one set of quotes here from our poem, he clapped his hands, and the thunders rolled, and the waters above the earth came down, the cooling waters came down. Then the green grass sprouted, and the little red flowers blossomed. So you'll note that I have the MLA documentation. This is in long quote format, and we have some repetition in here. The waters came down, the cooling waters came down, and repetition is another way that poets make their point and make their poem rhythmic and beautiful. And then we have details like we have the thunder and the cooling waters, and we also have that little red flower. And so we go from the greater to the lesser, to the smaller thing, the little red flowers. And then in this poem, God goes on to create a rainbow after the storm, and then to create animals who swam the rivers and the seas, roamed the forests and the woods, and split the air with their wings. So that's again a place where we almost feel like we could fly along with the poem and the poet. And then we have one of the classic love poems of all time, How Do I Love Thee by Elizabeth Barrett Browning. And I did try to find a reading of this poem that didn't sound like it was just too sweet and annoying. So this poem has been kind of overdone in a little bit and unfortunately has almost become a parody of itself. Also, poetry is often written in moments of anguish rather than in moments of happiness. And for some reason, our culture seems to value the poetry of anguish more than something pleasant and happy. And so this poem still contains some very strong imagery. I love thee to the level of every day's most quiet need, by sun and candle light. I love thee freely as men strive for right. I love thee purely as they turn from praise. And so this is where she's saying that she loves freely, and she also does not need to be praised for her love. She just loves because it's the right thing to do. And the poem ends with the imagery of an eternal loving afterlife with her husband. I love thee with the breath, smiles, tears of all my life, and if God choose, I shall but love thee better after death. And so this is a poem that she wrote to tell her husband, her beloved, how much she cared for him. And then interestingly enough, her husband wrote a poem that is not a love poem. It's still one of my favorites because I don't believe that Robert Browning was the narrator himself of this poem. He's made the narrator very unpleasant, and I think that's on purpose to make a statement about that sort of thing that happened and still might happen certain places in the world where My Last Duchess is written about a very wealthy man's previous husband who seems to have possibly met an untimely end. And so this poem is written from the point of view of an unsympathetic narrator, a man who is in the process of negotiating for a new bride, the daughter of a count of known munificence, meaning a rich man. And so in most poems, there is a narrator that is probably not the author, but might be, and the narrator tells a story, just like in short fiction. And so you might think, well, I didn't realize that poetry told stories, but many of the best poems do have a story embedded in them, as well as the possibly flowery language that you might expect. And in this poem, the previous Duchess, ominously referred to as the narrator's last Duchess, is understood to have died. And so here I have this documented, and you'll note that that this is Robert Browning rather than his wife who wrote this poem. And divorce would have been very rare for couples of their class during the historic time period of this poem. The narrator in the poem draws the curtain covering his last wife's painting and tells his new prospective father-in-law's representative that, quote, none puts by the curtain I have drawn for you but I. So he owns the painting just as I believe he thought he owned his wife. And this is how we should document if we have two authors with the same last name. We put their first initial in front of their last name so we can tell the difference. And this husband hides his former wife's painting as the only one who can lawfully gaze upon her. And this is how he continues, and he tells the representative what he thinks was really wrong with his previous Duchess. Too easily impressed, she liked whate'er she looked on, and her looks went everywhere. Sir, 'twas all one, my favor at her breast, the dropping of the daylight in the west, the bough of cherries some officious fool broke in the orchard for her, the white mule she rode with round the terrace, all and each would draw from her alike the approving speech, or blush at least. And I kind of read this as I imagine that the man who is narrating this poem seems like he was angry or not a happy person. And you'll note that even though this poem has rhyme in it and is very traditional in form, it still has a very strong voice, and the rhyme and the structure do not damage the meaning or the power of the poem. And another poem that we have to read and analyze this week is To His Coy Mistress by Andrew Marvell. And it's a different poem about love. And if you read it a couple times, you might realize that he's kind of trying to persuade someone into something. And he begins the poem with the suggestion, but had we but world enough and time, the coy mistress and he could wait indefinitely and think about where to go, then travel to the Ganges River in India, in fact, all over the world, and find rubies, which these are rubies, and he would be able to love her 10 years before the flood, meaning way before some of the early chapters of the Bible. So if they had magical powers and could live forever, they could go all over the place like one of our sci-fi heroes these days. But, even though if they had all the time in the world, and 100 years should go to praise thine eyes, and he talks about all her lovely body parts and how much he would praise them for hundreds of years. Then he appears to lose patience and tells her, but at my back I always hear Time's winged chariot hurrying near, and yonder all before us lie deserts of vast eternity. So this is kind of a downer, and he's trying to tell her that, time is fleeting and ahead of us is just a lot of death. And then he tells her that her quaint honor will turn to dust, and that the grave's a fine and private place, but none, I think, do there embrace. And is that a couplet and a half there? I mean, what kind of very creepy argument is that? And then he wraps up his argument by saying, thus, though we cannot make our son stand still, yet we will make him run. And I still like this poem, even though it is problematic in more than one way. It's just beautifully written. But do you think the argument is valid? And who had more at stake in the argument, the narrator or the coy mistress? And especially thinking about how this poem was written hundreds of years ago, what would have happened if the coy mistress had not been so coy? And then finally, we have My Papa's Waltz this week by Theodore Retke, and this poem gives the audience a clear sense of rhythm. I put a video out there that actually has the author himself reading this poem, or reciting this poem, which I just think is the coolest thing. And the poem can be read as if we are waltzing along with the boy and his father. And it contains vivid descriptions that bring the audience into the kitchen with the narrator's family. The whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death. Such waltzing was not easy. We romped until the pans slid from the kitchen shelf. My mother's countenance could not unfrown itself. The hand that held my wrist was battered on one knuckle. And so what do you think about this family, from the descriptions in it? And is it a happy poem? And really, does a poem have to be a happy poem? And then finally, because we can't possibly do all these poems justice in a short amount of time and space, I do have my works cited list here. So every time you quote from your sources, and I quoted from each of these poems, so I needed to have each of them listed on my works cited list. I've got them reverse indented. I've got the author's names first, the names of the poems next, the title of the book in which they are found, and the editor and the publisher and the Kindle edition and the year. So this is a model of how to do works cited based on our Seashell Anthology of Great Poetry if you ever need to document from that book. So I hope you all have a wonderful week, and I'm really looking forward to discussing our poetry on the discussion board. Thank you. Bye-bye.